Well, good evening, everyone. How are you? You're looking pretty good. I see some of you have been here for a while. Got that fire going good, and everybody's looking pretty happy and chatting around, and looks like a regular go-round here. And I think it's a good time for us to have some more stories. I really want to tell you some more of that story by Max Brand. The Untamed, you know the story. Well, we're on chapter 30, and well, there's not too far to go, and it's getting a little interesting. It's all the characters are kind of coming together, and it's going to happen. We're all waiting for the big boom. So let me just start right on into it. You guys can just kind of catch a seat when you have time. We're starting with chapter 30, as I said, and it's the manhandling. And it was close to sunset time when they reached the old Sultan place, where they found Silent sitting on the porch with Haynes, Kilduff, Jordan, and Reinhardt. They stood up at sight of the newcomers and shouted a welcome. Buck waved his hand, but his thoughts were not for them. The music he had heard Dan whistle formed in his throat. It reached his lips, not in sound, but as a smile. At the house, he swung from the saddle and shook hands with Jim Silent. The big outlaw retained Buck's fingers. "You're coming in mighty late," he growled. "Didn't you get the signal?" Buck managed to meet the searching eyes. "I was doing better work for you by staying around the house," he said. "How do you mean?" "I stayed there to pick up things you might want to know. It wasn't easy. The boys are beginning to suspect me." "The cowpunchers is getting so thick around those parts," broke in Purvis, "that Buck wouldn't even let me go back to his house with him to get my gun." The keen eyes of Silent never left the face of Daniels. "Don't you know that Gus Morris gives us all the news we need, Buck?" Reinhardt and Jordan, who were still chatting together, stopped to listen. Buck smiled easily. "I don't no ways doubt that Morris tells you all he knows," he said. "But the pint is that he don't know everything. Now how's that? The Rangers is beginning to look sideways and whisper when Morris is around. He's played his game with us too long, and the boys is starting to think. Thinking's always dangerous." "You seem to have been doing some tall thinking yourself," said Silent dryly. "You guess the cowpunchers are going on our trail on their own hook?" "There ain't no doubt of it." "Where'd you hear it?" "Young Seaton. He's one of them?" "Yes." "I'll remember him. By the way, I see you got a little token of Whistlin Dan on your arm." He pointed to the bandage on Buck's right forearm. "That ain't nothing," said Buck, shrugging his shoulders. "The cuts are all healing up. The arm's as good as ever now." "Anyway," said Silent, "you got something coming to you for the play you made agin the devil." He reached into his pocket, and he drew out several $20 gold pieces. Money was never scarce with a lone rider. And he passed them to Buck. The latter received the coins gingerly, hesitated, and then returned it to the hand of the chief. "What the hell's the matter?" snarled the big outlaw. "Ain't it enough?" "I don't want no money till I earn it," said Buck. "Life's getting too peaceful for you, eh?" grinned Silent. "Speaking of peace," chimed in Purvis with a liberal wink at the rest of the gang, "Buck allows he's the boy who can bring the doves o' the same into this camp. He says he knows the way to bring the girl over there to see reason." Buck followed the direction of Purvis's eyes and saw Kate sitting on a rock at a little distance from the shanty, in which she lived with her father. She made a pitiful figure, her chin cupped in one hand and her eyes staring fixedly down the valley. He was recalled from her by the general laughter of the outlaws. "You fellers laugh," he said complacently, "because you don't know no more about a woman than a cow knows about pictures. What do you think we should do with her, Solomon?" Buck met the cold eyes of Hayne. "Maybe I ain't Solomon," he admitted genially, "but I don't need no million wives to learn all there is to know about women." "Don't make a fool of yourself, Buck," said Silent. "There ain't no way of moving that damn girl. She's gone on a hunger strike and she'll die in it. We can't send her out of the valley. It's hell to have her dying on her hands here, but there ain't no way to make her change her mind. Hell, I've tried pleading with her. I even offered her money. It don't do no good. Think of that." "Sure it don't," sneered Buck. Why, you poor bunch of yearling calves, she don't need no coaxing. What she needs is a manhandling. She wants a master. That's what she wants." "I suppose," said Haynes, "you think you're the man to change her?" "None of that," broke in Silent. "Do you really think you could do something with her, Buck?" "Can I do something with her?" repeated Buck scornfully. "Why, boys, there ain't nothing I can't do with a woman." "Is it because of your pretty face or your winning smile?" growled the deep bass of Bill Kilduff. "Both," said Buck promptly. "The wilder they are, the harder they fall for me. I've had a 30-year-old maverick eaten out of my hand like she's been trained for it for all her life. The educated ones say I'm different. The old maids allow that I'm naive, and the pretty ones just say I'm a man, but they spell the word with capital letters." "Daniels, you're drunk," said Haynes. "Am I? It'll take a better man than you to make me sober, Haynes." Well, the intervening man jumped back, but the deep voice of Silent rang out like a pistol shot. "Don't you move for your 6 guns or you'll be playing agin me." Haynes transferred his stare to Silent, but his hand dropped from his guns. Daniels laughed. "I ain't no milepost with no hand pointing to trouble," he said gently. "All I say is that girl needs excitement. Life's so damn dull for her that she ain't got no interest in living." "Well, if you're fool enough to try," said Silent, "you go ahead." "Well, what are you planning to do?" "Well, you'll learn by watching," grinned Buck, taking the reins of his horse. "I'm going to ask that lady, soft and polite, to step up to her cabin and pile into some ham and eggs. And if she don't want to, I'll rough her up a little, and she'll love me for it afterwards." "The way she loves a snake," growled Kilduff. "By God, Silent," said Haynes, his face white with emotion, "if Buck puts a hand on her, I'll act like a man and not like a damn fool boy," said Silent, dropping a heavy hand on the shoulder of his lieutenant. "He won't hurt her none, Lee. I'll answer for that. Come on, Buck. Speaking personal, I wish that calico was in hell." Leading his horse, Buck followed Silent towards the girl. She did not move when they approached. Her eyes still held far down the valley. The steps of the big outlaw were shorter and shorter as they drew close to that girl. Finally he stopped and turned to Buck with a gesture of resignation. "Look at her. This is what she's been doing ever since yesterday. Buck, it's up to you to make good. There she is." "All right," said Buck. "It's about time for you amateurs to exit and leave the stage clear for a big star. Now just step back and take note of the way I do it. In 15 minutes by the clock, she'll be eaten out of my hand." Silent, expectant but baffled, retired a little. Buck removed his hat and bowed as if he were in a drawing room. "Ma'am," he said, "I got the honor of asking you to sidestep up to the shanty with me and tackle a plate of ham and eggs. Are you on?" To this Chesterfieldian outpouring of the heart, she responded with a slow glance, which started at Buck's feet, traveled up to his face, and then returned to the purple distance down the canyon. In spite of himself, the telltale crimson flooded Buck's face. Far away, he caught the muffled laughter of the outlaws. He replaced his hat. "Don't make no mistake," he went on, his gesture including the bandits in the background, and Silent particularly. "I ain't the same sort as these other fellers. I can understand the way you feel after being herded around with a lot of tin horns like these. I'm suggesting that you take a long look at me and notice a difference between an imitation and a real man." She did look at him. She even smiled faintly, and the smile made Buck's face once more grow very hot. His voice went hard. "For the last time, I'm asking if you'll go up to the cabin." There was both wonder and contempt in her smile. In an instant, he was in his saddle. He swung far to one side and caught her in his arms. Vaguely, he heard the yell of excitement from the outlaws. All he was vividly conscious of was the white horror of her face. She fought like a wildcat. She did not cry out. She struck him full in the face with the strength of a man, almost. He prisoned her with a stronger grip, and in so doing nearly toppled from the saddle, for his horse reared, snorting. A gun cracked twice, and 2 bullets hummed close by his head. From the corner of his eye, he was aware of Silent and Reinhardt flinging themselves upon Lee Haines, who struggled furiously to fire again. He drove his spears deep, and the cattle pony started a bucking course for the shanty. "Dan," he muttered at her ear. The yells of the men drowned his voice. She managed to jerk her right arm free and struck him in the face. He shook her furiously. "For Whistlin Dan," he said more loudly. "He's dying." She went rigid in his arms. "Don't speak," he panted. "Don't let him know." The outlaws were running after him, laughing and waving their hats. "Dan! Faint, you fool!" Her eyes widened with instant comprehension. Every muscle of her body relaxed. Her head fell back. She was a lifeless burden in his arms. Buck dismounted from the saddlery before the shanty. He was white, shaken, but triumphant. Reinhardt and Purvis and Jordan ran up to him. Silent and Kilduff were still struggling with Haines in the distance. Reinhardt dropped his head to listen at her breast for the heartbeat. "She's dead," cried Jordan. "You're a fool," said Buck calmly. "She just fainted, and when she comes to, she'll be telling me what a wonderful man I am." "She ain't dead," said Reinhardt, raising his head from her heart. "But Haines'll kill you for this, Buck." "Kate!" cried an agonized voice from the shanty, and an old white-haired Joe Cumberland ran towards them. "Just a little accident happened to your daughter," explained Buck. "Never mind. I can carry her in all right. You fellers stay back. A crowd ain't no help, and ain't no cause to worry, Mr. Cumberland. She ain't hurt." He hastened on into the shanty and laid her on the bunk within. Her father hurried about to bathe her face and her throat, and Buck pushed the other 3 men out of the room. "She ain't hurt," he said calmly. "She's just a little fussed up. Remember I said in 15 minutes I'd have her eaten out of my hand? I still got 10 minutes of that time. When that 10 minutes is up, y'all can come and take a look through that window, and if you don't see that girl eating at the table, I'll chaw up my hat." He crowded them through the door and shut it behind him. A cry of joy came from old Joe Cumberland, and Buck turned to see Kate sitting up on the bunk. Chapter 31. Laugh, damn it. She brushed her father's anxious arms aside and ran to Buck. "Shut up," said Buck. "Talk soft. Better still, don't say nothin'." "Kate," stammered her father, "what has happened?" "Listen, and you'll learn," said Buck. "But get busy first. I got to get you out of here tonight. You'll need strength for this work ahead of you. You got to eat. Get me some eggs and ham. Got 'em? Good, you there." He said this to Joe Cumberland. "Rake down them ashes. On the jump, Kate. Some wood here. I only got 10 minutes. In 3 minutes the fire was going and the eggs in the pan, whilst Joe set out some tin dishes on the rickety table under orders from Buck, making as much noise as possible. While they worked, Buck talked. By the time Kate's plate was ready, his tale was done. He expected hysterics. She was merely white and steady-eyed. "You ready?" he concluded. "Yes." "Then begin by doing what I say and ask no questions. Silent and his crew will be looking through that window over there pretty soon. You got to be eating and appearing to enjoy talking to me. Get that and don't forget it. Now mix in plenty of smiles. Cumberland, you get back into that shadow and you stay there. Don't ever come out into the light. Your face tells more than a whole book, and believe me, Jim Silent's a quick reader." Joe retreated to a corner of the room into which the light of the lamp did not penetrate. "Sit down at the table," ordered Buck, and he placed a generous portion of fried eggs and ham before her. I can't eat. Is Dan—" "I hear him at the window." He slipped onto a box on the opposite side of the table and leaned towards her, supporting his chin in his hands. Kate began to eat hurriedly. No, advised Buck. "You eat as if you was scared. You want to be slow and deliberate. Watch out. They've moved the boards that covered the window." For he saw a group of astonished faces outside. "Smile at me." Her response made even Buck forget her pallor. Outside the house there was a faint buzz of whispers. "Keep it up." "I'll do my best," she said faintly. Buck leaned back and burst into uproarious laughter. "Well, that's a good one," he cried, slamming the broad palm of his hand against the table so that the tin dishes jumped. "I never heard the beat of it," in a whispered tone aside. Laugh, damn it. Her laughter rang true enough, but it quavered perilously close to a sob there towards the close. I always granted Jim Silent a lot of sense, he said, and has he really left you all alone all this time? Damn near died of homesickness, don't you? She laughed again, more confidently this time. The board was suddenly replaced at the window. Now I got to go out to them, he said. After what Silent has seen, he'll trust me with you. He'll let me come back. She dropped her soft hands over his clenched fists. It will be soon. Minutes are greater than hours. I ain't forgot. Tonight's the time. Before he reached the door, she ran to him. 2 arms went around his neck, and 2 warm lips fluttered against his. God bless you, she whispered. Buck ran for the door. Outside, he stood bareheaded, breathing deeply. His face was hot with shame and delight. He had to walk up and down for a moment before he could trust himself to enter that ranch house. When he finally did so, he received a greeting which made him think himself a curiosity rather than a man. Even Jim Silent regarded him with awe. Buck, said Jordan, you don't never need to work no more. All you got to do is walk into a town, pick out the swellest heiress, and marry her. The trouble with girls in town, said Buck, is that there ain't no room for a man to operate. You just naturally can't ride a hoss into a parlor. Lee Haines drew Buck a little to one side. What message did you bring to her, Buck? He said. What do you mean? Look here, friend. These other boys are too thick-headed to understand Kate Cumberland, but I know her kind. Well, you're a little peeved, ain't you, Lee? Grinned Buck. It ain't my fault that she don't like you. Haines ground his teeth. It was a very clever little act that you did with her, but it couldn't quite deceive me. She was too pale when she laughed. A jealous feller sees 2 things for every one that really happens, Lee. Who was the message from? Did she ever smile at you like she done at me? Was it from Dan Barry that you brought word? Did she ever let her eyes go big and soft when she looked at you? Damn you. Did she ever lean close to you so's that you got the scent of her hair? Lee, I'll kill you for this, Daniels. When I left, she kissed me goodbye, Lee. In spite of his bravado, Buck was deeply anxious. He watched Haines narrowly. Only 2 men in this mountain desert would have had a chance against this man in a fight, and Buck knew perfectly well that he was not one of the 2. Watch yourself, Daniels, said Haines. I know you're lying, and I'm going to keep an eye on you. Thanks, grinned Buck. I'd like to have a friend watching out for me. Haines turned on his heels and went back into the card table where Buck immediately joined the circle. Wait a minute, Lee, said Silent. Ain't it your turn to stand guard on the Cumberlands tonight? Right-o, answered Haines cheerfully and rose from the table. Hold on, said Buck. Are you going to spoil all the work I done today with that girl? What's the matter? Asked Silent. Everything's the matter. Are you going to put a man she hates out there a-watching her? Damn you, Daniels, said Haines fiercely. You're rolling up a long account. It only takes 1 bullet to collect that sort of a bill. If it hadn't been for Haines, would the girl's father be here? Asked Buck. Besides, she don't like blondes. What type does she like? Asked Silent, enjoying the quarrel between his lieutenant and that recruit. Likes 'em with dark hair and eyes, said Buck calmly. Look at me, for instance. Even Haines smiled, though his lips was white with anger. You want to stand guard over her for yourself, says the chief. Sure, grinned Buck. Maybe she'd come out and pass the time of night with me. Go ahead and take the job, nodded Silent. I got an idea maybe she will. Silent, warned Haines. Hasn't it occurred to you that there's something damned queer about the ease with which Buck slid into the favor of this here girl? Well, all his talk about manhandling her is bunk. He had some message for her. I saw him speak to her when she was struggling in his arms. Then she conveniently fainted. Silent turned on Buck. Is that straight? It is, said Daniels easily. The outlaws started with their expectant grins dried out. By God, Buck, roared Silent, if you're double-crossing me, but I ain't going to be hasty now. What happened? Tell it yourself. What did you say to her?" "While she was fighting with me," said Buck, "she hollered, 'Let me go.' And I says, 'I'll see you in hell first.' And then she fainted." The roar of laughter drowned Haynes's further protest. "You win, Buck," said Silent. "Take the job." As Buck started for the door, Haynes called to him. "Hold on, Buck. If you're above board, you won't mind giving your word to see that no one comes up the valley and that you'll be here in the morning." The words set a swirling blackness before Buck's eyes. He turned slowly. "That's reasonable," said Silent. "Speak up, Daniels." "All right," said Buck, his voice very low. "I'll be here in the morning, and I'll see that no one comes up the valley." There was the slightest possible emphasis on the word up. On a rock directly in front of the shanty, Buck took up his watch. The little house behind him was black. Presently he heard the soft call of Kate. "Is it time?" His eyes wandered to the ranch house. He could catch the drone of many voices. He made no reply. "Is it time?" she repeated. Still, he would not venture a reply, however guarded. She called a third time, and when he made no response, he heard her voice break to a moan of hopelessness. And yet he waited until the lights in the ranch house went out, and there was not a sound. "Kate," he said, gauging his voice carefully so that it could not possibly travel to the ranch house, which all the while he carefully scanned. For answer, the front door of the shanty squeaked. "Back," he called. "Go back." The door squeaked again. "They're asleep in the ranch house," she said. "Aren't we safe?" "Shh," he warned. "Talk low. They aren't all asleep. There's one in the ranch house who'll never take his eyes off me till morning." "Well, what can we do?" "You go out the back way. You won't be seen if you're careful. Haynes has his eyes on me, not you. You go for the stable, and you saddle your horses. Then lead them out and take the path to the other side of the house. Don't mount them until you're far below the house. Go slow all the way. Sound travels far up this canyon. Aren't you coming with us?" "No." "But when they find us gone, think of Dan, not me." "God be merciful to you." In a moment, the back door of the shanty creaked. They must be open it by inches. When it was wide, they would run for the stables. He wished now that he had warned Kate to walk, for a slow-moving object catches the eye more seldom than one which travels rapidly. If Lee Haynes was watching at that moment, his attention must be held to Buck for one all-important minute. He stood up, he rolled a cigarette swiftly, and he lighted it. The spurt and flare of the match would hold even the most suspicious eye for a short time, and in those few seconds Kate and her father might pass out of view behind the stable. And he sat down again, and a muffled sneeze came from the ranch house, and Buck felt his blood run cold. The forgotten cigarette between his fingers burned to a dull red, and then it went out. In the stable, a horse stomped. He leaned back, locked his hands idly behind his head, and he commenced to whistling. Now there was a snort, as of a horse when it leaves the shelter of a barn and takes its first breath of open air. All these sounds were faint, but to Buck, straining his ears in an agony of suspense, each one came like the blast of a trumpet. Next there was a click like that of an iron striking against a rock. Evidently they were leading the horses around to the far side of the house. With a trembling hand he relighted his cigarette and he waited. Then he saw them pass below the house. They were dimly stalking figures in the night, but to Buck it seemed as though they walked in the blaze of 10,000 searchlights. He held his breath in expectancy of that mocking laugh from the house, that sharp command to halt, that crack of the revolver. Yet nothing happened. Now he caught the click of the horses' iron shoes against the rocks farther and farther down the valley. Still no sound from the ranch house. They were safe. It was then that the great temptation seized on Buck. It would be simple enough for him to break away. He could walk to the stable, saddle his horse, and tear past that ranch house as fast as his pony could gallop. By the time the outlaws were ready for the pursuit, it would be a mile or more away, and in the hills. Without such a handicap was enough. One thing held him. It was frail and subtle like the invisible net of the enchanter. That word that he had passed to Jim Silent, to see that nothing came up the valley, and to appear in the ranch house at sunrise. In the midst of his struggle, strangely enough, he began to whistle the music he had learned from Dan Barry, the song of the Untamed, those who hunt forever and are forever hunted. When his whistling died away, he touched his hand to his lips where Kate had kissed him, and then he smiled. The sun pushed up over the eastern hills. When he entered that ranch house, the big room was a scene of much arm stretching and yawning as the outlaws dressed. Lee Haines was already dressed. Buck smiled ironically. "I say, Lee," he said, "you look sort of used up this morning, eh?" The long router just scowled. "I'd make a guess you've had not much sleep, Haines," went on Buck. "Your eyes is sort of hollow. Not as hollow as your damned lying heart." "Drop that," commanded Silent. "You hold a grudge like a woman, Lee." "And how was the watch, Buck? Are y'all in?" "Nothing came up the valley, and here I am at sunrise," said Buck. "I reckon that speaks for itself." "It sure does," said Silent. "But the gal and her father are kind of slow this morning. The old man generally has a fire going before dawn has fairly come, and there ain't no sign of smoke yet." "Well, maybe he's sleeping late after the excitement of yesterday," said Bill Kilduff. "You must have thrown some sensation into that family, Buck." The eyes of Haines had not moved from the face of Buck. "I think I'll go over and see what's keeping them so late in bed," he said, and he left the house. "He takes it pretty hard," said Jordan, his scarred face twisted with satanic mirth. "But don't go rubbing it into him, Buck, or you'll be having a man-sized fight on your hands. I'd just about as soon mix with the chief as cross Haines. When he starts, the undertaker does the finishing." "Thanks for reminding me," said Buck dryly. Through the window he saw Haines throw open the door of the shanty. The outcry which Buck expected did not follow. For a long moment the long rider stood there without moving. Then he turned and walked slowly back to the house, his head bent, his forehead gathered in a puzzled frown. "What's the matter, Lee?" called Silent as the lieutenant entered the room again. "You look sort of sick. Didn't she have a bright smile for you this morning?" Haines raised his head slowly. The frown was not yet gone. "They aren't there," he announced. His eyes shifted to Buck. Everyone followed his example. Silent cursed softly. "As a joker, Lee," said Buck coldly, "you're some little Eva. I suppose they just naturally evaporated during the night, maybe?" "Haines," said Silent sharply, "are you serious?" The latter nodded. "Then by God, Buck, you'll have to say a lot in a few words. Lee, you suspected him all the time, but I was a fool." Daniels felt the color leaving his face, but help came from the quarter from which he least expected it. "Jim, don't draw," cried Haines. The eyes of the chief glittered like a hawk's who sees the field mouse scurrying over the ground far below. "He ain't your meat, Lee," he said. "It's me he's double-crossed." "Chief," said Haines, "last night while he watched the shanty, I watched him." "Well?" "I saw him keep his post in front of the cabin all night without a moving, and he was wide awake all the time." "Then how in hell—" "The back door of the cabin," said Kilduff suddenly. "By God, that's it. They sneaked out there and then went down by the other side of the house." "If I'd let them go," interposed Buck, "do you suppose I'd be here?" The keen glance of Silent moved from Buck to Haines and then back again. He turned his back on him. The quiet which had fallen on the room was now broken by the usual clatter of voices, cursing and laughter, and in the midst of it Haines stepped close to Buck and spoke in a guarded voice. "Buck," he said, "I don't know how you did it, but I have an idea." "Did what?" The eyes of Haines were sad. "I was a clean man once," he said quietly, "and you've done a clean man's work." He put out his hand, and that of Buck's advanced slowly to meet it. "Was it for Dan or Kate that you did it?" The glance of Buck roamed far away. I don't know, he said softly. I think it was to save my own rotten soul. On the other side of the room, Silent beckoned to Purvis. What is it? Asked Hal, coming close. Speak low, said Silent. I'm talking to you, not to the crowd. I think Buck is crooked as hell. I want you to ride down to the neighborhood of his house. Scout around it day and night. You may see something worthwhile. Meanwhile, in the utter blackness which precedes the dawn, Kate and her father reached the mouth of the canyon. Kate, said old Joe in a tremulous voice, if I was a praying man, I'd get down on my knees and thank God for delivering you tonight. Thank Buck Daniels, who's left his life in pawn for us. I'll go straight for Buck's house. You must ride to Sheriff Morris and tell him that an honest man is up here in the power of Silent's gang. But, he began, she waved her hand to him and, spurring her horse to a furious gallop, raced off into the night. Her father stared after her for a few moments, but then, as she had advised, he rode for Gus Morris's. Yeah, chapter 32, Those Who See in the Dark. It was still early morning when Kate swung from her horse before the house of Buck Daniels. Instinct seemed to lead her to the sick room, and when she reached it, she paid not the slightest attention to the old man and his wife who sat nodding beside the bed. They started up when they heard the challenging growl of Black Bart, which relapsed into an eager whine of welcome as he recognized Kate. She saw nothing but the drawn white face of Dan and his blue penciled eyelids. She ran to him. Old Sam, hardly awake, reached out to stop her, but his wife held him back. It's Delilah, she whispered. I seen her face. Kate was murmuring soft, formless sounds which made the old man and his wife look to each other with awe. They retreated towards the door as if they had been found intruding where they had no right. They saw the fever-bright eyes of Dan open. They heard him murmur petulantly, his glance wandering. Her hand passed across his forehead, and then her touch lingered on the bandage which surrounded his left shoulder. She cried out at that, and Dan's glance checked in its wandering and fixed upon the face which leaned above him. They saw his eyes brighten, widen, and a frown gradually contract his forehead. Then his hand went up slowly and found hers, and he whispered something. What did he say? Murmured Sam. I don't know, she answered. I think it was Delilah. See her shrink? Shut up, cautioned Sam. Ma, he's coming to his senses. There was no doubt of it now, for a meaning had come into his eyes. Shall I take her away? Queried Sam in a hasty whisper. He may do the girl harm. Look at that yeller in his eyes. No, said the wife softly. It's time for us to leave him alone. But look at him now, he muttered. He's making a sound back in his throat like the growl of a wolf. I'm afraid for the girl, Ma. Sam, you're an old fool. He followed her reluctantly from the room. Now, said his wife, we can leave the door open a little, just a crack, and you can look through and tell me when she's in any real danger. Sam obeyed. Dan ain't saying a word, he said. He's just a-glaring at her. And what's she doing? Asked Mrs. Daniels. She's got her arms around his shoulders. I never knew they could be such a pile of music in a gal's voice, Ma. Sam, you was always a fool. He's pushing her away to the length of his arms. And she, whispered Mrs. Daniels. She's talking quick. The big wolf is standing close to him and turning his head from one face to the other like he was wondering which was right in the argument. The ways of lovers is as queer as the ways of the Lord, Sam. Dan has caught an arm up before his face, and he's saying one word over and over. She's dropped on her knees beside the bed. She's talking. Why does she talk so low, Ma? She don't dare speak loud for fear her silly heart will bust. Oh, I know. What fools all men be. What fools. She's asking him to forgive her. And he's trying all his might not to, whispered Mrs. Daniels in an awe-stricken voice. Black Bart has put his head on the lap of the gal. You can hear him whine. Dan looks at the wolf and then at the girl. He seems sort of dumbfounded. She's got one hand on the head of Bart. She's got the other hand to her face, and she's weeping into that hand, Martha. She's given up trying to persuade him. There was a moment of silence. He's reaching out his hand for Black Bart. His fingers is on those of the girl. They both staring. Aye, she said, and what now? But Sam closed the door and set his back to it, facing his wife. I reckon the rest of it's just like the ending of a book, Ma, he said. Men is all fools, whispered Mrs. Daniels, but there were tears in her eyes. Sam went out to put up Kate's horse in the stable. Mrs. Daniels sat in the dining room, her hands clasped in her lap, while she watched the gray dawn come up in the east. When Sam entered and spoke to her, she returned no answer. He shook his head as if her mood completely baffled him, and then, worn out by the long watching, he went to bed. For a long time, Mrs. Daniels sat without moving, with the same strange smile transfiguring her. Then she heard a soft step pause at the entrance to the room, and turning, she saw Kate. There was something in their faces which made them strangely alike. A marvelous grace and dignity came to Mrs. Daniels as she rose. "My dear," she said. "I'm so happy," whispered Kate. "Yes, dear. And Dan?" "He's sleeping like a child. Will you look at him? I think the fever's gone." They went hand in hand, like two girls, and they leaned above the bed where Whistlin Dan lay smiling as he slept. On the floor, Black Bart growled faintly, opened one eye on them, and then relapsed into slumber. There was no longer anything to guard against in that house. It was several days later that Hal Purvis, returning from his scouting expedition, met no less a person than Sheriff Gus Morris at the mouth of the canyon leading to the old Salton place. "Lucky I met you, Hal," said the genial sheriff. "I saved you from a wild goose chase." "How's that?" "Silent has just moved." "Where?" "He's taken the trail up the canyon and cut across over the hills to that old shanty on Bald Eagle Creek. It stands—" "Yeah, I know where it is," said Purvis. "Why'd he move?" "Well, things was a-getting too hot. I rode over to tell him that the boys was talking of hunting up the canyon to see if they could get any clues of him. They knowed from Joe Cumberland that the gang was once here." "Cumberland went to you when he got out of the valley?" queried Purvis with a grin. "Straight." "And then where'd Cumberland go?" "I suppose he went home and joined his gal." "He didn't," said Purvis dryly. "And then where is he, and who the hell cares where he is?" "Hell, they're both at Buck Daniels' house." "Look here, Purvis. Ain't Buck one of your own men? Well, I seen him up the camp just a while ago. Maybe you did, but the next time you call around, he's apt to be missing." "D'you think?" "Yeah, he's double-crossed us. I not only seen the girl and her father at Buck's house, but I also seen a big dog hanging around the house, Gus. It was Black Bart, and where that wolf is, you can lay to it that Whistlin Dan ain't far away." The sheriff stared at him in dumb amazement, his mouth open. "They's a price of $10,000 on the head of Whistlin Dan," suggested Purvis. The sheriff still seemed too astonished to understand. "I suppose," said Purvis, "that you wouldn't care special for any easy lump sum of $10,000, what?" "In Buck Daniels' house?" burst out the sheriff. "Yep," nodded Purvis. "That's where the money is, if you can get enough men together to get in for Whistlin Dan Barry." "Do you really think I'd get some boys together to round up Whistlin Dan? Why, Hal, you know there ain't no real reason for that price on his head." "Do you always wait for real reasons before you set your fat hands on a wad of money?" The sheriff moistened his lips. $10,000? $10,000, echoed Purvis. "By God, I'll do it. If I got him and the boys would forget all about Silent, they're afraid of Jim, but just the thought of Barry paralyzes them. I'll start rounding up the boys that I need today. Tonight we'll do our planning. Tomorrow morning, bright and early, we'll hit the trail. Why not go after him tonight?" "Because he'd have an edge on us. I got a hunch that devil can see in the dark." He grinned apologetically for his strange ideas, but Purvis nodded with perfect symphony, then turned his horse up the canyon. The sheriff rode home a-whistling. On $10,000 more, he would be able to retire from this strenuous life. Well, there you go, folks. That's a pretty good little piece of that story, and it's going to be dang good here. It's coming up. Gosh darn, we're chapter 33 next, and I'm getting excited for this story. And I'll see you right away. Next week, I think, would be great. Bring some friends. Bring a bottle. Let's sit down around this fire again. Until then, this is Clay Steele.